Welcome back, guys. We're so excited to continue in our series on the Gospel according to Luke. Last week we talked about the burial of Jesus, and this week we get to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now we're doing this video content in hopes that it'll challenge everyone while we're not able to meet face to face. And I hope that you'll be able to take this and start conversation with it, and hopefully share it and spur a conversation with you and others. I hope that this will be challenging and that you will gain something that is actionable and practical as well. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Smith, and I am from St. Louis originally, and I played baseball all growing up, which of course means that I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan. And as I was growing up, one of my favorite games of all time, and really it's one of the greatest games of all time anyway, bar none, is Game 6 of the 2011 World Series. Now, for those of you who don't know, the way that it worked out is the Cardinals had not played very well during that game. They had a couple of errors, some problems base running, and they were down to their last strike. It was 2 strikes, 2 outs. David Freese at the plate in the bottom of the 9th inning, Game 6 of the World Series, and they were facing elimination to the Texas Rangers. Now, there are some casual fans who turned off their TVs at that time because they were so disappointed. And the game was basically sealed. The Cardinals were down. They were down to the last strike. And David Freese was an okay player. He was fine. He deserved to start that year. He was a fine player, but he wasn't a superstar. He wasn't anything incredible. And he was facing Neftali Feliz, who was a good pitcher that year. He had won Rookie of the year before, and it was over. All hope was lost. There was no shot that the Cardinals were going to come back and win that. So it made sense. It made sense for a lot of people to just tune out, to walk away and just walk away disappointed and not worry about it anymore. Basically, they would just have to wait until the Cardinals had a better core. They had more good players, maybe one more great player to be able to help them to the World Series and get them over the hump, to be able to make them champions again. They'd have to wait a few more years before they could have that championship ring, because right now, in that moment, in Game 6 of the 2011 World Series, the bottom of the 9th, 2 strikes, 2 outs, all hope was lost. And it created a sinking feeling of disappointment for a lot of Cardinals fans because they had come so far. Maybe they didn't really deserve to be there. They weren't the best team in the playoffs by any reason or by any means, but they had made it this far. And it was so disappointing whenever the goal was so close, but the Cardinals were falling short. And that's a little bit of a taste. That disappointment that Cardinals fans felt in that moment was a little bit of a taste of what the disciples felt when Jesus had passed away, whenever he had died on the cross and he was buried. That's the sort of disappointment, but theirs was so much greater. And the men and women who had followed Jesus through his ministry, they weren't just wondering when they would win their next sports championship. They were wondering what to do with the rest of their lives, because they had high hopes for overthrowing Rome behind this man named Jesus, but he was dead. He wasn't who they thought he was. He wasn't going to overthrow Rome. So for some of them, it made sense to just tune out and just to walk away and to return to the way things were before Jesus had showed up. They would have to wait for the next great leader to show up so that they could finally overthrow Rome and rule themselves. They would have to wait another few years for a champion of the people. So in Luke 24, 2 of the disciples have decided to cut their losses because it makes sense for them to just tune out and to just walk away. So they start to head to a town called Emmaus. And these men are coming into the story, and at a moment whenever a few women have already claimed that Jesus has risen from the dead because they met some angels at the tomb. And they told them that Jesus is alive. But when people go to check out the tomb and they investigate, it's just an empty tomb. Jesus isn't there to talk to them. There's no proof that Jesus is alive, at least not yet. So turn with me to Luke 24, verse 13. It says, "Now that very day, 2 of the disciples, were on their way to a village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and debating these things, Jesus himself approached and began to accompany them. These two men were just debating about what had happened to Jesus in Jerusalem. Maybe one of them thought, it's not so bad that Jesus died. Maybe even it's good that he's gone. I get to go back to Emmaus. Or maybe they were just talking about and debating about what this meant for them personally. Maybe they were debating about what this meant for Israel to overthrow Rome, because now they'd need a new leader for their movement if they're going to overthrow Rome. But whatever their positions are, whatever they were thinking about in verses 13 and 14, whatever they were divided about, whatever they were debating about, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whenever Jesus shows up on the scene in verse 15. Because the moment that Jesus shows up, the story begins to revolve around him again. All attention is pointed toward him. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Then he said to them, "What are these matters you are discussing so intently as you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?" Now, these disciples feel like what happened to Jesus was important for everyone. It was the ultimate spectacle, and everyone everywhere was affected by it. Now, this stranger, he can't possibly be so out of the loop that he doesn't know about Jesus, the Nazarene, about his crucifixion. Now, the irony in this is that the one man in all of creation who would know about what the crucifixion really was, about what really happened on that cross, and about what really happened in that tomb, the one man who would know about that is standing right in front of them. Of course he knows. He knows better than anyone. And he said to them, "What things?" "The things concerning Jesus the Nazarene," they replied. "A man who with his powerful deeds and words proved to be a prophet before God and all the people. And how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Not only this, but it is now the third day since these things happened." Now, for these guys here, they were expecting Jesus to overthrow Rome. They were expecting Jesus to reinstate Israel as its own nation. And that's a theme that we see throughout all of Luke and even in other Gospels, that they were expecting Jesus to be a military leader, because they expected the Messiah to come and to overthrow all of the evil leaders there. But that's not what he had come for. They had no idea that Jesus was right in front of them, that the Jesus they followed was so much more than a prophet, because that's what they thought. They thought that Jesus was just a great man, or that he was a prophet before God, but just a prophet. And he wasn't anything great to them. But the Jesus who was standing in front of them, this Jesus, the real Jesus, was not concerned about overthrowing Rome. He had much, much bigger plans. The real Jesus, the Jesus in front of them, the Jesus talking to them in this moment, his goal was not to overthrow Rome, but to overthrow death. And he wasn't overthrowing death just for Israel, but for all of mankind. He was overthrowing death so that we could all have life in eternity. His resurrection showed that he had the power to do just that. His resurrection showed that he had successfully done it, that he had successfully overthrown death. And these two disciples, they had no idea that even though the Redeemer that they wanted was not in front of them, the Redeemer that they needed was there, alive, in front of them. And he was there, ready to work on their behalf. He was ready to invite them into the real kingdom of God. Furthermore, some women of our group amazed us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and said they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb, and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. These men, they didn't believe the testimony of the women. So when they say they didn't see Jesus at the tomb, what they're saying is that there was no evidence that Jesus was alive. If Jesus was alive, they should have seen him at the tomb. But there's another bit of irony here. Because in the beginning of the chapter, the women are told, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" So these men were expecting to find Jesus at a tomb. They were expecting to find Jesus where the dead are laid. But instead, they find Jesus among the living. Exactly where the angels said he ought to be. They found Jesus walking with them, alive. So he said to them, "You foolish people, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. Jesus takes this opportunity to remind the men that they could have and should have seen this coming. There's no need to be disappointed, according to Jesus, because it's necessary. It's necessary for Christ to die like this so that he can enter into his glory. According to Jesus, they lack faith because their hearts are slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Now, they forgot what Jesus had told them, because Jesus has said earlier in this gospel that Christ should die so that he can enter into his glory. They must have forgotten. They must not have believed it. They must not have understood. But even if you don't understand all that, it should be obvious, according to Jesus. If you just read Moses, if you read the prophets and you understand them, then you'll know that this should happen. It goes on to say, "So they approached the village where they were going. He acted as though he wanted to go farther, but they urged him, 'Stay with us, because it is getting toward evening and the day is almost done.' So he went in to stay with them." Jesus was here for a reason. He was here for a reason, and he knew that they would have him stay with them. So he acted like he was going further so that they would invite him in. He was there for a purpose, and the purpose was he wanted to change their lives. But he waited until they invited him in. He wanted them to invite him into their lives so that he could change them forever. That's exactly what he does. In verse 31, when he had taken his place at the table with them, he took the bread, he blessed it, and broke it, and he gave it to them. At this point, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. You think about it, we always remember lasts. We remember famous last words for celebrities. We remember last words that we spoke to a loved one before they may have passed away. We remember the last wishes of the dead in a will or on their deathbed. We remember the last time we saw a loved one, and we reminisce whenever we see them again. We may throw a going away party for the last time that we see someone. We remember lasts. And Jesus was recreating one of the most famous last moments of his life here, whenever he broke the bread, just like he did at the Last Supper. The Last Supper was one of the most iconic moments of Jesus' life. It was when he sat at a table and he broke bread with disciples who loved him and with a man who would end up betraying him to death. It was a moment that defined Jesus' ministry to everyone, even to those who wouldn't accept it. He showed love and he broke bread with them. It was in this moment for these two disciples when he was finally revealed. And in that moment, just like that, he was gone. They had to have been perplexed or bewildered again. And they had to have said something like, "How did we miss this? How did we not know it was him? We should have known that it was him." And the conversation continues until they get to the point where in verse 32 they said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he was speaking with us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" They knew deep in their hearts, they knew almost instinctually that it was him, and their hearts had sank when he had died. 3 days earlier, they they had witnessed the death of Jesus, or they'd heard about it because they may not have even been there. But whenever Jesus was crucified, their hopes were crucified along with him. And their hopes were buried with him. Their hopes of being redeemed, of Israel being redeemed from the rule of Rome, they were dead. And they should have known that this was the Jesus in front of them. But for some reason, even though their hopes were dead, even though 3 days earlier everything seemed to have fallen apart, for some reason when this stranger showed up, it was like Jesus was there again. When he talked to them, their hearts were revived. That burning inside of them started to well up again. Now back to the World Series in 2011 when the Cardinals were down to their last strike. Game 6 of the World Series, facing elimination. There was a lot of casual fans who tuned out. They walked away. They didn't get to witness the best moment of the game, because all hope had seemed lost until that triple was hit off the bat of David Freese, and it was hit out to right, and it just out of the reach of Nelson Cruz in right field, and David Freese hit a bases-clearing triple. He tied it up. The Cardinals would go on to win Game 6 off of his bat too, and they would go on to win Game 7, and they would they would win the World Series that year. They would be the World Series champions. And for those people who tuned out and walked away, they didn't get to see it. They didn't get to witness that hope be revived. Because all hope was lost until that moment whenever the ball flew off of his bat and hit a bases-clearing triple. Now for those disciples of Jesus here on the road to Emmaus, all hope is already lost. They've already lost all hope. For them, everything is falling apart. And all hope is lost until Jesus himself shows up. And he reignites the hope in their hearts. Now the question for you is, where do you need to see hope reignited? You remember at the beginning of this walk on the road to Emmaus, these men were debating. They were debating about what this all meant for them. And they experienced a new hope when they stopped debating with each other and they started listening to God. So what area do you need God to bring hope? What area do you want to feel that burning hope? Where are you debating with man when you should be listening to God? As soon as that burning sensation, that hope was reignited in them, they didn't let that be it. They weren't content to just sit there. They weren't content just to have their own hope reignited, because in verse 33, it says they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them gathered together and saying, "The Lord has really risen." It's true. The women are right. Jesus is alive. They didn't let just this burning hope stay within them. They had to go proclaim it. "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how they recognized him when he broke the bread. They talked about how Jesus was dead, but he was alive. How he was different, but he was still the same Jesus who broke bread with us. These disciples allowed the hope of Jesus to change all of their plans immediately. They were where they wanted to be in Emmaus. That's where they were headed. According to verse 13, they were going to this village Emmaus, and they made it there. They were there to stay. But when they met the risen Jesus and they realized who he was, that he was alive, that he was not just a prophet, but that he was resurrected so that he could enter into his glory, they immediately went to the other believers. And they began to share this burning hope that they had. And they began to share the truth of their testimony to the others. So now, have you allowed God to do the same for you? Have you allowed God to instill this burning hope, this kind of hope that spurs you to go? Have you allowed God to do that in your heart? Because this week, right now, we have that kind of opportunity. We can stop debating about what God has done during this time or what he's doing right now. And we can just allow his hope to spark something within us that compels us to loving action. The resurrection of Jesus should fill us with hope because our God overcame death. And he didn't just do it just because he did it for us. He overcame death for us. Now, people still talk about the excitement of that 2011 World Series. Are we going to continue to talk about something so much greater, something so much more exciting? Are we going to continue talking about the resurrection of Jesus and what that really means for us? Because that 2011 World Series was very exciting. I loved it. But it's nothing compared to what our God did when he was embodied into a man, when he was incarnated. He lived a perfect life and he died on a cross for our sake. He was buried and actually he was dead. And then he was raised from the dead. Because that should give us hope. I hope this was helpful for you. And thanks for listening.